Hello, and welcome to Mormons, Mystics, and Muons. Eldon and I are here. And today, Eldon, we were going to talk about, I wanted to talk about Sapiens because it was a book that a lot of people had been talking about for a while, kind of in my journey and meaning making. And I just hadn't read it. People kept referencing it as like, yeah, this is how things make sense. And Bill Reel and Jacob Hansen, their recent discussion, Bill Reel talked about a lot about Sapiens, and you see it mentioned a lot in the post-Mormon, ex-Mormon community, and to some degree, it sort of serves as a kind of like an atheist Bible. And so I felt like I needed to read it. A little skeptical of how much I agree with it. But there's I think there are a lot of fascinating things that I think he does a really good job at covering. But then there's some pretty significant, I think, blind spots that it has that I don't think, I don't think he's aware of it too. And so I wanted to talk about kind of what I agreed with and what I disagreed with. And then you recently read a book called
Yeah, it's called The Invention of Yesterday. And I'm probably not saying his name right, but Tamim Ansari. And I think it's kind of in the similar vein of an updated narrative of world history. And Tamim is someone who's from Afghanistan originally. So I think it's a little bit more, he tries to bring in more of a holistic approach to the history of the human family with less emphasis on just the Western or kind of European perspective. It was really, I read it about maybe over a year ago, and I keep going back to it just here and there at things. It's subtitled The 50,000 Year History of Human Culture, Conflict, and Connection. So full disclosure, I have not read Sapiens, although it's on my list of books, which is ever growing to get to. But I know a lot of people who have, and like you say, it seems to become kind of the textbook for people who've gone outside of the Mormon faith or find a different path. And so I'm excited to hear your deconstruction of this, or at least your thoughts here.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I think it's so popular, I mean, it's well written and has a lot of good points, but I think that a lot of people, when they deconstruct or when their just worldview shatters and they're faced with this meaning crisis, it's really uncomfortable. Like you have this heavy shelf, and then that crashes, and instinctually you want to figure out, well, if I don't believe this, like, what do I believe? And I think this is a very easy, accessible, and in many ways really helpful framework. But I think that there's something to be said for just recognizing that, recognizing that need for meaning, being able to maybe sit with discomfort for a while and not knowing, while not necessarily getting stuck with, because some people, they shift to something else and they're like, yeah, this is true. This is what, atheism, materialism, science, evolution, sapiens, and there is nothing after death, and that's it. And then other people get stuck on like, well, yeah, we'll never know, and that's the beauty of it. Like, you don't know if something's there after death, and then they kind of give up too, and have a resistance. And I know when I left Mormonism 6 years ago, I didn't quite believe the CES letter, that whole narrative, but Fair LDS certainly didn't do any favors in their response. So I was like, well, this doesn't add up. I don't know exactly what I think about the whole narrative. I did think like, well, I don't think I'll find any answers or any like truth, because if there is like truth out there, um, we would have figured it out by now. Which
Yeah.
ironically, I mean, I think there is just so much stuff on like a higher level, so much overlap between spiritual traditions and Eastern philosophy that you're just not aware of at all in Mormonism, that people have figured stuff out, and there's a lot of overlap between that and science. Um, but for me, it was helpful to like not be sure of where I was going to settle after. But I think it's really important to re-ground yourself in the fact that everything's a myth. And I talked about this, I think, in an episode or two ago, and not in a myth, not in the sense of like a myth is an illusion or it's a lie. Alan Watts says something about like a myth is an image whereby we can make sense of the world, um, or reality. And so I think it's helpful to review why everything's a myth, and that's, ultimately grounded in the fact that like we're talking, thinking, understanding largely in a language that we made up. And so we've experienced these ineffable things, and then we just kind of draw a box around it, both societally. We develop language and as a way to communicate and have this kind of intersubjective reality, but then even individually in your own growth from being born, like you don't have any names or concepts of anything. You're just feeling sensations and energies and phenomena. And then you start putting boxes around it because you're like, this feels this way. And then I make this sound, and then I get this thing that takes that feeling away, and you start
Yeah.
calling hunger. And so everything's the ultimate truth, reality, big T truth is ineffable. Like the idea of God, the universe. These are things that we've put words to, but the words are limitations. Even an apple, like it's not described by those words. It's
Mm-hmm.
useful. You can't describe salt. And then I was thinking about this lately, is that, within constructs or symbols, thinking, talking, so that's one side. You can experience things in a way that's beyond constructs, and that's what these mystical experiences are. So that's, kind of the right side of the brain, which is an oversimplification. But largely we think, right? Um, we're using constructs, and I think there's two different approaches to making sense. And one approach, another of them's right, but one approach is you're dividing things into smaller and smaller building blocks. Dividing bodies into cells, into molecules, into atoms. And then like, yeah, we thought that's where it ended. And then like, oh, there's protons, neutrons, electrons. And we thought that's where it ended. And ultimately, if you kind of take a step back and realize where do you think there is no end to that pursuit, because whatever you're going to find when you split the electron or the subatomic particle, you have to describe with some other construct that you've made up, and it's never been discovered before. So you're making up this definition, and there's no destination that you'll get to where you're like, oh, and like, what would that even look like? When you're like, oh, we finally found this thing, and this is what everything's made up of, and that's somehow indivisible. And so I think it's helpful to realize that this idea of chopping things up smaller and smaller and smaller, thinking there's a destination we'll get to in which we finally find what everything's made up of, is not pointless, but it's a fractal and it'll go on in infinity. Alan Watts talks about this, talks about the humor of this as the universe trying to explore itself. And so the width of the smallest particle is going to be exactly the width of the knife that you're using to cut it. And then you get a thinner knife and you find a smaller particle. So I think that's
Yeah.
the one approach. And then the only other approach that I can think of, and there's probably philosophical names for this, but is this symbolism or using parables or analogies where you start explaining something by comparing it to something else. You get down to energy, and then like these subatomic particles are made of energy, and then to explain energy, you start talking about electricity, which kind of moves you back up the frame, and then you talk about electrons and whatnot. So I think that's the other way, is that you can use symbolism to say, and this is this Hermetic principle of like as above, so below, is that you can understand certain things, you can understand reality by kind of looking at dreams and how that parallels. So I think that it's helpful to realize that there's two different approaches, but in the end, you're ultimately just making a myth, a story that describes reality, and those aren't fun. They are not fundamentally true or false themselves. It's like a graduation of believing that babies come from storks to then believing that they come when a man and a woman hug, and then a baby just forms, and then to realizing like, oh, there's egg and sperm. But even then, like that whole story is simplifications. And so there's complexer and complexer myths and frameworks. And so he focused a lot on myth, and I think that's kind of a good background to frame it.
I like that. One of the things that is said in this book, The Invention of Yesterday, if I could, because Tamim Ansari is a Afghanistan-born history professor, basically, who wants to tell a story. He lived in the U.S., or I think he's still living in the U.S., but wants to tell a more holistic narrative of the story of the human family. And so it's a very different story than what you might get in a U.S. history class. He says the shape of the narrative is what it all comes down to in the end. History deals in facts, of course, but in history, those facts fundamentally serve a narrative. When we construct our story, we are inventing ourselves. That's what we were doing in those caves long ago, gathered around the fire, passing on to our children what we remembered about our grandparents, and reminiscing about life-changing adventures that we'd shared, and arguing about which of us really killed the bear, and drawing conclusions about the meaning of life from the stars we saw above. For when ancient folks looked up at the night sky, they didn't just see stars. They saw constellations. They said, there's a bear. And they said, hey, look, a mighty hunter. And their companions nodded. And as long as everybody in the group saw the bear and the mighty hunter, there they were. It's all too easy for us modern folks to say the constellations weren't really there. Yes, it's true that those constellations existed only in the minds of the people looking, but then everything we see and know as human beings is in some sense a constellation. It's there because we see it. We exist as constellations of people. We're immersed in constellations of ideas. We live in a universe of constellations, which are themselves made up of constellations. In the social universe, constellations are as real as it gets. And I think what you're talking about, that idea of everything being a myth, I mean, that was mind-blowing for me as a full believing member of the Mormon church, to be told I was one thing that existed before this world, and then here I am in this world, and then I'll be something when I pass on into the next life that has this continuity about it as me as a person, even though I'm really just a constellation of things. I'm made up of this microbiome of living organisms inside of an infrastructure made of biological organisms. And this is where we can talk more about consciousness, and we've talked in past episodes about conscious agents, like Donald Hoffman's perspective. It's hard to say where I stop and where I begin in terms of in a family unit, in a occupation, in a history of where I've been and the people that have influenced me and who I have influenced. In a way, we are a walking myth. We are a constellation of untold number of individual things that we've all kind of agreed on that are divisible, when really take that away, and where we start and where we stop becomes a lot more fuzzy. It's kind of like zooming in more and more. You get to the quantum field, and it becomes just probabilistic. The lines get very fuzzy, and I think that's kind of what we're saying here is everything's a myth, and that shouldn't be viewed as just a cop out, like you say, to no need for further exploration. In fact, I think it's the very opposite. It becomes empowering. It
Mhm.
becomes very empowering to think of everything as a myth, and that we can build the narrative from here.
Yeah, that was one of the things that he quotes Francis Bacon on like how do we define knowledge, which I think this idea of myth and frameworks applies to that. Francis Bacon says the real test of knowledge is not whether it is true, but whether it empowers us. So ultimately, that's what science is doing, is like Newtonian physics or Newton's laws, quantum physics. It's not like one was true and then it became false, and then they're all just approximations, and they work within a certain range to a certain accuracy, and then we're refining them into greater and greater frameworks, laws, quote unquote laws.
Higher resolution.
Yep. And in the true measure of these myths are, not all myths are created equal. I think that two main things are, like, one is it internally consistent. You can believe that, you can believe in prayer all you want, but then you have to have to some, and I believe there is some effect and power phenomena of that. But how do you explain it when it doesn't work? Or, so these frameworks, these myths, the level of internal consistency, the number of phenomena they kind of explain, and how well they do that, I think and whether it empowers you to predict things and to affect things.
I also think the more it unifies rather than divides, and where religion tries to house spirituality, I think spirituality is always at the place of unification, where too often religion becomes dogmatic and does a lot more of dividing than it does unifying.
Yeah, and I think you don't have to go seeking for that, because I think that you should just approach of, like, I'm just going to find out, like, approach truth, give up on any sort of give up on it being arriving at a certain destination. But yeah, it's just very convenient that the truth, when you pursue it, things do trend towards unity. And that logically makes sense, because again, if you're trying to describe what the universe is, it makes sense that it would come down to one thing that it's made out of. Because if it's just two things, like, matter and consciousness, or substance A and substance B, like, why not just one thing? Like, maybe we didn't divide it far enough. So I think that's this idea, idealism, everything's consciousness, that you can actually get explanations for matter, space, time through that.
It reminds me of a quote, and it's attributed to a French philosopher. His name was Michel de Montaigne, which I'm probably saying wrong, but it could be older than that too. But it says, any religion, if allowed to rise to a position of dominance, will suppress new ideas and oppress those who don't conform. This happened with Catholicism in medieval Europe, Calvinism in colonial New England, and Mormonism in territorial Utah. Of course, this French guy wasn't saying that, but he said the Protestant Reformation demonstrated how readily an open quest for truth can collapse into a fierce defense of dogma. And this is the quote part. It said, "Bring me into the company of those who seek the truth, and deliver me from those who have found it."
Yeah. So, I think, so going into Sapiens, so Sapiens is trying to describe, okay, this is how the world, this is how Sapiens, how we got to where we are now. And this idea of myth, again, I think there's I thought of the analogy of like, somebody can ask you like, describe a computer to me, and you can say, oh yeah, you've got these different windows, and you click on these different things, and when you click on this happens, and you can explain to them ins and outs, all how to use the operating system to do whatever they want. And you've described the computer, but you've described it on like a user interface software level, and you haven't spoken at all about the electronics or anything. So then you can ask somebody else to describe the computer, and they can just talk about processors, electricity, hardware, and describe things in great detail there, not have any reference to software user interface. And they've also described the computer as well. Neither of them are wrong. They're just different ways of describing something. And so that, again, I think speaks to this, what is truth, or just kind of this awareness of, when you're describing something using these myths, you have to kind of be aware of the myth nature. And so it does a lot of things well, and it describes Homo sapiens society through creating tribes and concepts and religion. But despite attempting to be a comprehensive discussion of society, of our history, it doesn't address psychedelics. It doesn't talk about mystical states. It doesn't address or bring up like idealism versus materialism, which is this huge debate in philosophy. It doesn't address or try to explain quantum physics at all, or say anything about how that fits into it, or really epigenetics. It talks a lot about like DNA, natural selection. Doesn't discuss epigenetics, doesn't talk about like psi experiments. So there's a whole bunch of things that it acts as though it presents kind of a theory of everything, but it just leaves a bunch of parts on the table. And so that's this other analogy. It's, I think it's like trying to put a model together. You've got this picture of this plane, say this plane that you're making, and then you use the pieces in the kit to create that plane, but you just don't use certain parts. You don't use the wood pieces, or don't use the glue because you don't like them, or it's harder to do it that way, or maybe you just didn't even see that there was glue in it. So you just do the best you can, or maybe you can't figure out how certain parts fit in. You put the plane together. Maybe it looks somewhat similar to the picture on the front, but if you're not aware that you're missing those pieces, I think you've got this blind spot. You're going to have fallacies if you think that you've created the same thing that's on the picture, rather than saying like, hey, I created this model. It's different because I didn't use these parts here. So, you have to view it somewhat, view it with that in mind. I think it's the same way with Sapiens, is like, you can find a lot of explanation from it, but you also have to realize that there are these huge subjects, these huge issues, ideas, phenomena, that it just doesn't explain at all or take a stance on. And so you have to keep that in mind, that this is an incomplete myth that may be wrong in a lot of areas.
I think that's healthy. I mean, keeping the incompleteness of everything in mind. There's not going to be a book that's going to cover the history of the human family beyond just a narrative, because in order to form coherent thought, or keep the interest of any kind of reader over any number of pages, you have to filter out. Ultimately, our brains are just filter machines, filtering out what isn't necessary for the moment, and sometimes that we are able to do that better than others. And so I think that's a healthy perspective, that here's Sapiens, here's another perspective, here's another way. It's like that model ultimately is just a model of the plane. It's not the actual plane. It's missing probably more components than it actually has. But if you have the body of the plane and you get the paint job right from the outside, it looks like the plane. Doesn't have a functioning motor in there as a model, probably. So it's not a plane, but it's a representation. And I think that's what all of
Mhm.
history is. And I think in a lot of ways, the for the members of the church that are trying to hold on to a kernel of faith while they're being introduced to new ideas about the church's history, they're seeing that history can be told. History is just a connection of certain points, specific points. If you're telling a history of anything, you're just selecting a certain set of data or a certain set of points to form a narrative. And for a long time, the Mormon church had a really good ability, a very strong ability to control what those points were. And over time, of course, with more information and more access to information, there's a lot more points that are coming into the field of view. And so bickering over or trying to say that this version is right or this version is wrong, it seems to me like a lot more useful, uh, I guess, like direction of energy to think more about what is true from more of that fractal perspective. Like, I think the computer model's a great analogy, and I think about that often. The computers as a model for how we connect in as people and as inside of our brains, the synapses and things that are going on there, just like in a computer network, and it's all powered by electricity. Thinking of things from the fractal perspective, to me, seemed to get me closer to understanding truth, rather than thinking I've come across the right version of the right set of data points to tell me the real version of history, and I'm going to stick by this one. It's more true that people tell stories about history that favor their confirmation bias. That's what tends to be more true, rather than what the story that's being told about what's true is true, because you could pick a different set of data points that make it not true in so many cases.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that, you can just say anything happened in history and that's what happened. But it seems to be a lot more fruitful effort, at least what I found, for me to let go of the narratives that I've been given about the history of the church, for example, or the history of the world, and be more open to seeing it as Sapiens is a great resource. The Invention of Yesterday could be a great resource. These a lot of different ways to see it, and the picture starts coming together with all of those different resources, kind of a constellation, as it
Mhm.
were. Constellation.
Yeah, I think taking that model analogy, that airplane model analogy, into Mormonism, the church, I think what a lot of people miss is that, well, like you said, um, we one of the reasons why we simplify things or filter things or create constructs, models, simpler models, part of it is just we can't comprehend infinity or can't comprehend it in the complexity, or maybe not. Um, there's a limit in our complexity. And then the other thing to consider is that we simplify because it's useful. We have quantum physics that is more accurate and applicable and could be used on Newtonian scales. But it'd be crazy to try to calculate where the ball's going to fall using quantum physics and waveform functions when like Newtonian physics does it much easier, much simpler. And so you use the right tool for the job. And so one person may have put their model together the best they could. And they're like, this is great. I mean, this, I like it. This is, I did it. And somebody else, where that first person, they want to put it on their shelf and to them it looks just like the picture and it works great, and the other person wants to like throw it around and get it to glide a bit, and they've done it the
Yeah.
same way and they're like, no, it keeps breaking, you need to use the glue. And they're like, no, so I've put it together and like my way of putting it together is right and yours is wrong. But that first person's like, actually this is does everything that I wanted to, and I didn't need to use the stinky glue. And so for some people, like Mormonism works and it works well, and they don't know anybody that's homosexual, and they don't have a kid that's coming out of the closet, and they don't have, a mixed faith marriage. And it's like, it brings them a lot of joy, and it is working really well for them. Whereas for another person, it, you know, it's really harmful. And so then that person reads a CES letter, they read Sapiens and like, no, I've got it right. My model's right. And so I think there's not this awareness of that, like, yeah, people in the church, they may have had very actual spiritual experiences, mystical experiences. And just because you didn't have it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And the church may be working well for them. Now, there's something to be said for like what it does on a societal level, and the harm that it can cause there. But I think that's something to be aware of, is that you've just put it together a different way, and that may work for you, and you've got less parts left over. But then you also have to be open to, yeah, maybe those models work for those two people, but if somebody can come along and say like, hey, here's a way that you can put it together, it looks great on the shelf, you use all the parts, or you use much more of the parts, and it flies and it looks great on the shelf, and maybe it's even simpler to do it that way, you have to be open to updating your model as well. And so I think that, yeah, Sapiens simplified things because it is complex. But I think, like we've presented here, I mean, there is actually a way, if you spend the time to explore some of these things, there's a way that quantum physics and spirituality and psychology and religion actually integrate pretty well, and is much more elegant and simpler in the end. But it may just be really different and than what you thought reality was. And so, I think that's.
Yeah, I think the temptation to follow a set of beliefs that puts humans at the very top is
Mm,
really strong. I mean, looking around, we're obviously really advanced creatures, and so any narrative, any notion that puts us at the top, I mean, ultimately, I think that is the fall. If we're talking about symbolically referencing the story of the Garden of Eden, the fall of mankind was when we assumed that we were dominant. And even in those passages where it talks about dominion over the earth, I think we have failed, or we're in the process of failing, or we haven't yet awoken to the ability that we have as humans to be gardeners of the planet instead of dominators of the planet. And these narratives that have got us to where we are, maybe they were as good as they could be to get us to where we are, but there needs to be an expansion of, I think, awareness and understanding, which doesn't come from looking outward so much as looking inward. And I think that, yeah, there's just a lot that we could do to include other people in our narrative when we're telling the history of the world, and to not be so centered around a European or a Western notion about where we've come from, where we've going. And I haven't read *Sapiens*, so I'm not saying this is where *Sapiens* falls short. Um, but
well, it does.
being open to those things is something. If you're a believing person, or if you're struggling with the testimony of the gospel, so to speak, being open to other ways to tell the history of the world can be very empowering. It was for me, as just being a
Mhm.
human, right?
Yeah, and it does apply to Sapiens, because Sapiens is a very, I don't know what the term for it is, but I guess you can call it a sapien centric, homocentric perspective. And I think now more than ever, because it explains, oh, we believe in religion because of this, because it's useful to, like, it was useful for us to believe in the same thing, to conquer other tribes. And so that's why religion was created. But we live in this world where the existential threat of AI is actually real. And so, it's not inconceivable that AI could wipe out all of humanity. The universe would continue to exist and evolve, and actually AI would be evolving. So that's an interesting shift that I've got down here to discuss, is that like evolution is so much the explanation in the materialist perspective, and it's DNA and natural selection for survival of fittest, but now it's jumped from biological to electronic. But yeah, I mean, even without AI, I mean, the universe still progresses. And so whatever meaning that you have of like, this explains reality, this explains the universe, this is like the purpose of the universe. If you delete humans from it, does it still explain the universe? And if it doesn't, and
Yeah.
if it was just using religion and evolution to explain it, actually, it's a they're thinking too small. So I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
He does talk in here about like he focuses on the idea or the ability to create myths as a characteristic of sapiens, of like what differentiated us from others. But I think he ignored that the idea, he just presents myths as something that arise basically because we needed to band together and it was more useful to all believe in something. But going back to the blind spot of the psychedelic or the mystical experience, he's blind to the fact that there are these mystical experiences that are occasioned, basically the same mystical experience through mushrooms, through breath work, through lying in a cave in darkness, not moving for 3 days, or whatever Pythagoras did, or fasting. All these different ways, regardless of the culture, something is happening, that there's this state of consciousness that doesn't even require words. So before we even invented language, like there was a state of experiencing and understanding like reality that happened, and it has a lot of overlap with religion. And so he's not aware of that, and maybe he never experienced that. But once you realize that that happened and predates even language, and is not dependent on culture, and it's kind of boggles your mind that somebody now can have a mystical experience, can go take psilocybin, and they can come to the same like realization of the universe, because doesn't come in words, as Aristotle did, or somebody like 3000 BC did that was in some tribe. That's kind of mind blowing, and it does connect you with these other people. So I think just not being aware that the myths, actually religious, particularly spiritual myths, came from the mystical experience rather than just being created to like band tribes together and to believe in the same thing. I mean, it's much more compelling of an argument that if there's an experience that is so transcendent of time and culture, that religion
Yeah.
actually mirror that, rather than the explanation that myths were created to band together.
And I also think that from a Western and very individualistic perspective, like we find ourselves in this society today, that we have to kind of argue for why we would need to band together and build a narrative around that. That seems like a very logical way to go about it. But I don't know that we've always viewed ourselves as individuals so much as we do in the world today. What if ancient peoples just, it wasn't like they were saying, hey, we need to band together, because maybe they were operating on just a much more connected uh, as a conglomerate, right? Like just the notion of I'm me and I've got to work together with these other thems, kind of a thing. Um, Seems like like that idea evolved out of it. That wasn't the baseline, I don't think.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean that's interesting, because I've sat and watched flocks of birds moving in like concert with with one another, and you realize, like, Sapiens posits that basically, yeah, that myths were created to band together so we could come together and kill other tribes and create dominance and get more people to, to manipulate, etc. It's useful, it's utility. Um, and that's our evolution. That's what put us above everything else. But it's funny because actually, if you look at nature, we've gone backwards in the sense that, yeah, these flocks of birds, they are one. And, I think evolution actually, we've evolved to have an ego, to move out of a collective consciousness and operating as, yeah, we're just part of nature, we're part of the one. And then we get this idea of an ego, we're separate, we're individual. And then we transcend through that, and through spiritual development, through scientific knowledge, like we're actually coming back around to realizing that we're one again. And so, but we had to
Yeah.
get out of, we had to evolve and be individualized. And this beautifully mirrors actually like our own, and again, this is that symbolism that as above, so below, is that the process that we went through as a species mirrors a process that you go through being born. You're being born, you
Yeah.
think you're one with
Absolutely.
everything. And then you finally realize, like, oh, I have a body, I'm this, they're another person.
You
And
learn
then,
language. Yeah.
yeah, and then you think you've arrived as like a 30, 40-year old, and then all of a sudden you lose your Mormon faith, and then you have this, this transformation, and then you realize, like, oh my gosh, we're like one with everything again. And so again, it's this, you return back to the childlike. And Michael Pollan talks about this in this book, is like psychedelics are putting you at these states where you actually have the child mind again. And this is like what Christ talked about, except a man, except you become as one of these little children, you can't enter into the kingdom of heaven, which,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an interesting,
Yeah.
it shows a flaw in this idea that, like, myth is just to band together and to manipulate and to unify, but it doesn't show the fact that we actually evolved out of unity. And he talks about this with kind of the evolution of the agrarian society, where we used to just be hunters and gatherers, and we lived in the moment, and we didn't plant crops and think about the future. We were very present. And then all of a sudden, like, we went through this agrarian revolution, and now we had to plant crops. And he makes an interesting point about how it actually wasn't in the individual's best interest. Like, they didn't actually have more stability or more time. And the agricultural revolution was actually not helpful for the individual. And it was really kind of the plants that domesticated humans by controlling humans to actually rely on these crops. But he talks about, that humans as a whole, the species could now advance and grow faster because of the agricultural revolution. So it's interesting because he starts distinguishing like a consciousness as Homo sapiens, even though the individual, it did not serve their best interests to go through the agricultural revolution, made things more difficult for them. But there's almost this ego of the Homo sapiens, which kind of goes to this idea of like, it was a consciousness, a cosmic consciousness,
collective conscious,
like Gaian consciousness, a human consciousness. The cells in our bodies, one neuron, they're all different levels, and we have one perspective at a certain level. We have to be aware that there's other levels are happening. So.
Yeah, I'm interested in like the learning that's going on in the world of the microbiome, and I'm gonna do one of those things where you talk about a study but you don't remember the name of it or where you read it. But I did read this study once, not long ago, where some researchers actually killed off the microbiome, or they altered the gut bacteria in a certain kind of fish, and when they did that, the fish could no longer school.
Hmm.
schooling together, where they all swim in unison together. They're making turns basically at the same time almost, and they're all working together. And when you killed off the microbiome in the certain species of fish under observation, it basically lost its ability to school anymore. And that kind of research I'm really interested in, because it is that kind of that fractal, looking at the level of what am I. I'm In some ways, I think of my body as just an infrastructure for very small things, microscopic things that are just all living in what would be, a metropolis of just billions of billions. It's like when I'm eating something, I'm feeding me, sure, but I'm actually feeding them,
Hmm.
kind of a thing. And when I think back of evolutionarily speaking, the idea of going from hunter gatherer to the agricultural society, and then we have this debate going on in the world about, like, the, what do they call it, the diet where they only eat meat, or we have the diet where we only eat vegetables. It's like this strain, this tension between those two styles of living that we lived under for thousands of years or longer. And when it seems to me that when we develop those new stages in an evolutionary timeline, they just kind of echo or recur. There's a hermetic principle of rhythm, where if there are people who are becoming more aware that you can't just spray crops to kill all the bugs so that humans could eat the food, because that actually changes the entire balance. It's like when the pest control guys come and knock on my house, and they ask if they can start spraying my house. I say no, because I don't want to kill the bugs, because the bugs are doing things that I can't even comprehend that are important to me. And if we're spraying all the bugs and killing them, we'll find out what we're doing, kind of a thing. Which doesn't make for a really good summer gig for the guy selling pest control. But I wonder about that principle of rhythm, where we go from, like, as the snake moves from one
Hmm.
side to the next, and that repeating pattern, that recurring, the echo of the hunter gatherer, the agrarian society. And we're talking about these diets that are one or the other now. And it's like the wholeness is all of it. We're a child, and then we're an adult, and Jesus said, you must be born again, you must become like a child. It's the echo of those things. The
Hmm.
Jung talked about this, integrating the child, the inner child, with the self. And I think there's connections with all of those concepts.
Yeah. Yeah. But there's one quote that I had down from the book. At one point, he said, "There's no gods in the universe." I forget exactly what context that he said that, but I just had noted that this is a materialistic perspective. And so he does a lot, he focuses a lot on, like, well, there's the objective reality, and then there's a subjective reality, and there's like an intersubjective reality, like this fiction versus reality um, dichotomy that is really, I mean, we all operate. We believe, like, oh, physical is real, but then mental is not real. People believe in these gods in the universe, but they're not real because they're mental. But like the physical stuff that you experience is real because there is a pretty consistent stability to physical reality. But really, even our experience of matter, if you deconstruct it, like, oh, you're not seeing the tree across the field, your neurons are sensing photons that are transmitting through nerve cells and being reconstructed in your brain, and your brain's actually doing this error checking and kind of constructing proposed scenarios, and it's like, oh no, that doesn't match it. So really, if you really deconstruct it, it's a spectrum of different levels of reality, mental reality. Things that only exist in the quote unquote mental plane are just as real as the quote unquote objective physical plane. They're just different. And so the experience of matter, that, like, my hand is touching the table and two physical things are pushing, contacting, it's actually just, it's a myth, it's a fiction, that our brain uses, but there's no physical things actually touching, because it's, no atom, no protons are touching each other. It's this probabilistic placement of subatomic particles that you can only get so far before a force pushes between them. So again, it's myth. You just have to be aware of that to realize that it's not an either or. And this, I like that he talks about an intersubjective real plane or truth, because that's really, I think, if you look at these quantum Bayesianism, cubism, this Bernardo Kastrup's view of reality as dissociated agents, sort of like in a dream, alter egos of a dissociated universe in a dream. That's really what they're saying. What we're saying reality is. It's a intersubjective reality between all of the parts of consciousness. Some of them that are manifesting as very complex individuals. Some of it is nature, and there's forces that are unseen. So yeah, this intersubjective thing, I think, is the key, rather than this, objective or subjective. He talks about LLCs, that this, he talks about the creation of these fictional entities, like an LLC, that like it doesn't really exist according to him, but it's something that we agree exists, and it gives certain protections under the law, and that's how society can advance. And so he talks a lot about LLCs, or he talks about the agricultural revolution being like for the good of Homo sapiens, or even actually that wheat was kind of the mastermind of it, because it went from this very little footprint to now this huge footprint. So he kind of hints at the fact that there are perspectives where you can look at like the collective consciousness of a species, or an entity like an LLC. And so I like that. I just think it's short-sighted to create this dichotomy of like a physical reality versus a mental fiction.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of Jordan Peterson's earlier writings. He has a textbook that he wrote, I think in the mid '90s or something, before he kind of became very controversial and very much kind of on the world stage. But it's called Maps of Meaning. And one thing he talks about in there is how a child who is crawling around exploring their world goes to touch a vase, and it's like a nice glass vase or whatever, and they bump it, and mom comes in like, oh no, don't touch that. To the child, they don't know anything about it being a vase. It's suddenly, what that thing means is important to mom, and it's important that I don't touch it because I get scolded when I do. So to the child, it's not a vase as such. It is an important object that gets me in trouble when I come into contact with it or come too close. So that is enough meaning to begin to move around my world. It's a map that I've created of meaning with all of these objects that I'm moving about the world. And in a lot of ways, that never changes. What we do as we grow is just get more higher resolution in terms of the definitions around the things, but it's still maps that we're using to navigate our world. And so the vase, all of the meaning of it, all of the vase is what's in the minds of the people who have any kind of meaning around it, other than the glass vase in the 3D world itself.
Yeah. And it goes along with he talks about, I've got down here, this question of like, does DNA cause advances? Further down, I think somewhere in my notes here is this question of like, well, is DNA more important or is culture more important? And kind of connects with what you're saying about, the shared meaning that we have, where, we view DNA from a very materialistic perspective as like, that is this kind of the evidence, the storage device for progress. But that's just one aspect. And then there's also like language, the whole the construct of language, as language evolved, now there's this entity, this collection of meaning that exists beyond the life cycle of one individual, just like DNA gets passed down, language gets passed down. And so instead of just viewing it as like DNA having, there's this very hard coded physical record of progress, and we explain everything through natural selection and random mutation, which now is, there's epigenetics and other things that are showing a very different picture of evolution and kind of going in more a Lamarckian way too, as well as the random mutations. So, I mean, that picture is getting a little muddied, but yeah, you have to realize that just as much as DNA codes for changes and builds upon itself, like the quote unquote fiction, the non-real things like culture and language, like that also evolves. And it's just as real as the physical realness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So another thing I had written down here was this question: does DNA cause mutations in DNA cause changes in advances in culture, which is what's put forth kind of in Darwinian evolution, or do they correlate with changes of deeper nature according to Donald Hoffman's theory? So again, it's easy to look at the brain and neurotransmitters and fMRI stuff and saying like, oh, this is creating consciousness because there's a correlation with how this person is thinking and what we're seeing in physical matter. Same thing with like DNA. We see that DNA changes and it corresponds to evolution. Again, if you're going into Donald Hoffman's perspective, which I think is very valid, that's correlation but not causation. And he's saying that space and time are not fundamental, and they're actually just kind of projections, the way we've evolved, the way we're accessing like a VR headset of reality, but reality is actually like the computer simulation that we're all a part of, and we're all part of that processing power. The things that we're seeing in the VR headset, they're just corresponding to like deeper stuff that we can't understand in the computer, in the simulation. So it's another thought is that the correlation causation thing, I mean, that caution applies to consciousness and DNA, is that like it's so easy to say, oh, this caused these changes. Well, it's actually correlated. He talks about the Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking that we're covering a lot of ground here, and we're talking a lot about ideas that hopefully, I think it's easy to be caught in the dichotomy of the of something being true or not true, or it's like we're talking about a way to kind of reconcile it and hopefully move forward toward unity, because one of the notes here is progress is toward unity. I like that notion a lot, that with war going on in Ukraine or other places in the world in a modern age, there's part of me that's like, wow, it's hard to comprehend how that is even an option on the table. And I'm definitely not anything close to a world leader or someone who's making the kind of decisions that would, that would send people off to battle. And I frankly am glad that I'm not. But like that battling in the 3D world is going on inside of cultures right now. It's going on inside of religions. It's going on inside of families. It's going on between husband and wife. And the thing about many religions, including Mormonism, is that battling is a part of it. Battling is part of the recipe for it to work. It's a fight. There's so much that's militarized about it. And I think maybe some of that can be traced back to when religion was being used from the imperialistic kind of domination, my tribe wins, so our God's the God that's in charge kind of days, where we can, with the advent of AI, I actually think it's possible to transcend a lot of these recurring traps that we keep falling into as humans, where I'm right, you're wrong, I've got the stronger army, so I'm going to prove that I'm right, kind of a thing. Um, and I think that's exciting, but also terrifying to think that AI could be could play such a role. As long as its wings don't get clipped, I could see AI going all the way to the extent of destroying the human family, or going all the way to the extent of saving the human family. It's possible for it to go in either direction,
Mhm.
and it's almost like, as long as we're in the mindset of the dichotomy of us, them, then it's going to be a fight over AI
Yeah.
rather than seeing what AI can do to serve the us as the human family, and what we could do as gardeners to serve the planet that we emerged from.
Right.
It,
Instead of debating whether AI is conscious, um, and trying to
mm,
figure out how to put safeguards around it that some other country isn't going to do. Actually, the best strategy that we can have is realize our idea of consciousness is meaningless because there's no consensus, and it doesn't matter. It can be not conscious according to somebody and still launch nuclear weapons. And then just clean up our act and treat each other nicely, and treat AI as um, another entity that deserves respect, and
mm-hmm.
not give it any reason to feel threatened, and like clean up what we've got on the internet. So what it's being trained on is
Yeah,
creating a personality that
self-fulfilling.
doesn't. So like that's actually the best. It's difficult, but that's our best chance of surviving AI, is to model, like a parent, model what we want AI to do. And then that's all you can do, because it will take off. There's no stopping it. So, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think that unity, I mean, that really is the only way forward. I mean, a lot of people, especially religious, people just despair over how terrible the world is. And they're clutching their pearls. And it's funny because two people can have vastly different views. And I remember having an argument with somebody I was dating in college, and she was just like, "Oh, the world is just, it's going to hell in a handbasket." And I was like, "Actually, I think it's like better than it's ever been." Um, and you have completely different perspectives, but I think that there are a lot of things that are breaking and just seem like there's no path forward. And actually, a recognition that we're all one is the only path forward. He talks about in the
Mm-hmm.
book that this cognitive revolution happened because there was this transcendence of like the 3D world, and that we could start thinking and using language, and there was kind of a mental plane that existed rather than other animals, and that allowed Homo sapiens to collaborate, um, uh, and have an economy and trade and whatnot. And I think that's happening now, is that there's a physical plane, a mental plane, but now there's this like spiritual plane, and a recognition of like an interconnectedness, an actual oneness. And that, as people are recognizing that, both spiritually, scientifically, um, meditation, psychedelics, whatever it is, um, many people are converging on this, and that's creating a path forward that is not possible in any other way. I mean, it's different to believe that you're actually one with the universe, other people, they're another reflection of this higher consciousness of which you're a part of. That's different than just believing, oh, the golden rule is a good way of acting, because if we all did it, then that would work pretty well. So just pretend like the other person is you, and then treat them the way you want. Like, this is actually no recognizing, understanding. knowing that that is the truth.
There's a foundation for morality there beyond
Yep.
what religion provides. Because if the person across from you is a part of you, or if you are connected to that person beyond what you can comprehend, then you realize that harming them is harming you. And
Yeah.
it makes me think of what Jesus said when he said something like, I'm going to paraphrase poorly here, but if you've got you're pointing to the mote in your brother's eye, calling him out, and you've got a beam in your eye. And if I understand the words there, you're seeing a splinter in somebody's eye while you've got a 2x4 in your eye. Well, if it's right up on me, if it's that close, it's that big. The nature of something being that close to my eye, to the other person, theirs is also a beam. But looking at me, mine looks like a splinter. When I look at them, theirs looks like a splinter. They're beams to both of us, because from our perspective inside, whatever it is being that close, it's taking up that field of vision to that extent. I think he's talking about the oneness, the unity there of what I'm seeing from my eye behind this object that's blocking, that's obstructing my vision, is the same thing that the person across from me is seeing, that's obstructing their vision. And so in a sense, we're judging them where, you could say, yeah, you've got the worse sins, or the idea where if everybody's laundry was hanging out and showed all of their problems, then I would take my laundry any day, kind of a thing. It's like all the laundry, all the beams, all the motes are part of all of us. And, easy for me to say sitting here on a podcast, I don't have the finite solutions for all of it here. And I wouldn't expect that any single person does. It's a networked effort because of the nature of the connected world we live in today. And it doesn't take everybody in the world coming to this idea either, that we're one. It just takes maybe a certain percentage of the human family operating as if we were, that would potentially change the systems to bring them more in alignment of serving us, serving the planet a little bit better than we currently are. So really, I'm just a voice in the chorus, hopefully, that's getting louder with the notion that there's an interconnectedness between all of us.
Yeah, I like what you said about, a morality, because this is where, when Jacob Hansen, Bill Ruhr will talk about, and I think this is a valid sticking point when people are questioned about like Sapiens explaining everything and trying to base your morality off that. Jacob was saying like, well, what is it? Morality is there? This just sounds all subjective because, should one person die just because the whole society would benefit from it? And it gets difficult to answer those questions. And then because you're deifying humans over other animals or environment or whatnot. And so you can find some morality in Sapiens, but it gets dicey. But if you, and it's very human centric. But yeah, if you, in idealism, the idea that we're all conscious, the universe is consciousness and we're all different parts of that. And I think this dissociated identities, this idea of, realizing how one person's mind, when they dream, turns into a little avatar that you're experiencing now. Your perspective is on this little avatar, and you're interacting with other people in a world, physical matter, that you can swear is not you. They're separate than you. If somebody in the dream tried to convince you that they were you and that you're part of this bigger mind, you just think they're crazy. And it's just not what you're experiencing at all. I think that these are helpful, again, symbols, recursive kind of fractal ways of understanding reality. But I think that's a very good model for morality that isn't dependent on just humans or whatnot, but like, you treat another person, any specific scenario, be like, well, recognizing that this is me, the world is me, we're all part of this bigger consciousness, that anything I do actually outside, to another person, to another thing, to the environment, I'm also doing it to myself. And then you can, as you mature in this and heal yourself, so you can actually be objective about this, you can start to balance, what is the greater good of not just society, but everything. And so I think it's a very solid, much more objective morality than I think you get from Mormonism or any religion. He talks about all men being created equal, as that this is just kind of a myth and that it's not really true. That's just an ideal that we use. It's not really, we said that in the founding of our country, but we, again, he presents it as some ideal that is used to kind of unite society. But I think really, again, in idealism, it is true, like it's literally true that we're all fractals of the infinite. And biology is actually the myth in the sense that it's part of space-time, which isn't fundamental. It's something that we can learn from and use. But again, if you understand there's kind of a deeper, it's not that the dream isn't real, it's real. It's just there's a deeper reality that is part of a bigger consciousness.
It's like the bigger consciousness is using carbon-based life forms right now for what, let's say, makes up the dreamscape. Like if AI continues on this path and becomes, silicon or carbon-based life forms, it's just how the consciousness is. It's almost like the puppet master is the consciousness.
If you have that sense of the deeper reality, you realize that they're all icons on the desktop, and that everything being one, humans, AI, it's all manifestations of the universe. And so it's all intelligence, it's all consciousness. And so you just balance it. And this kind of goes along with what he's talking about. He talks in the book about how history just relentlessly moves towards unity in tribes and in larger governments, and that the measure of progress is unity. And I think interestingly enough, it's the same message in quantum physics, in psychology, in these spiritual traditions, is like there's this movement towards unity, a collective consciousness, even like AI. I mean, it's a unification of, kind of the internet of our consciousness. He says a bunch of things about modern science, which I think shows, another big blind spot. He says that modern science has a willingness to admit ignorance, that no concept, idea, or theory is sacred and beyond a challenge, and that modern science is supple, and modern science has no dogma. And when present observation conflicts past theories, we give deference to the observations. That's all true from a materialist perspective. And, the scientific revolution, like it did shift away from like, okay, we're not just going to believe stuff because the church says it. Like we need proof, we need a scientific method. And it's been really useful, but it's been based on materialism, this idea that matter makes up the universe and that consciousness somehow magically arrives from matter. And you see more and more scientists, studies, phenomenon, questioning or not lining up with this. And I was listening to something recently that was talking about, I forget who it was, but they had a model of scientific progress where aberrations are just, yeah, they're viewed as aberrations, but eventually they become so significant that there's a shift in, you know, a seismic shift in the collective understanding, that it adapts and it embraces what was previously viewed as aberrations. And so, yeah, I think this is really romanticizing science. A lot of this is true. Science is more objective, but materialism so far has been sacred to science, and any challenge of that is met without that objectivity. So I think that's one thing that he wasn't that in tune with there.
Yeah, and happiness as a delusion. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so he talks about happiness and kind of oversimplifies it to serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin. It kind of promotes the idea that like we can change it through medication. Doesn't really give any, I don't think really much time to mindfulness, which, you know, is more effective. But then he kind of puts this pessimistic view of like, well, ultimately happiness is kind of this delusion. You know, studies show that when somebody, you know, has some great thing, supposedly great thing happen in their life, you know, they'll get this little bump in happiness, but then they just go back to the baseline that they were. So it's kind of this set point that you can't change. And I think that is a pessimistic view of it. And yes, happiness in some ways is delusion, but so is like sadness. And there you can leverage that. I mean, Stoicism is built around this idea that whatever meaning you give something, you're giving it to it in kind of in terms of a perspective compared to something else. You're like, oh, I want this, I want that. And to be happy, you can either try to get what you want, or you can just change what you want. And you can kind of take these perspectives of, you know, instead of wanting this something more that I don't have, you can train yourself to like think about what if you lost everything you had, just kind of sit with that for a bit and then come back to the present and be like, oh man, I'm really grateful for what I have.
It's possible to see your life as already having everything. And I think because it's all relative. And this, the evolution of scientific frameworks moving from Newtonian to Einsteinian and into quantum, I think parallels the a human what can happen with a human lifetime, kind of like we were talking about earlier, where you know, a child who is born as being one with everything then begins to divide once they learn language. It's like happiness is relative. Does the Disneyland employee go to Disneyland on their day off? You know, happiness is, and maybe they do because they don't get to ride the rides that they want to while they're on their shift, but maybe. But it to me, it's like we want to arrive at a place where we're kind of have this constant, let's say, happiness. We're looking for it, but really happiness comes after, for me, it comes after particular, it comes after suffering. It comes after periods of depression, or because I only feel it when it's like eat a bunch of sour candy and then eat something that, you know, or eat something that's super salty and then eat something that's super sweet, or eat something that's super salty and then just eat like a date, like just a date that's all natural, off the tree. Dates are super sweet if you're not eating high fructose corn syrup all the time. If you're not eating processed sugars, what nature provides in terms of little love packets like bananas and dates and strawberries, those are super sweet, because relatively speaking, that sweetness, what you're experiencing, is much sweeter than what you otherwise would. You know, if you're drinking soda pops and things every day, then you go and eat just a date by itself, you're not going to get that same boom, like hit of sugar. And so I think happiness, the delusion of happiness to me, is that it's an arrival place or that it's a constant state. And I think that's the allure of a heaven as taught by religion, that we have this infinite, eternal bliss state, which I think is an impossibility,
Yeah, I
because
think
it's relative. You got
I
to
think
go to
there.
hell, and then you go to heaven, and you're in heaven once you're there. But you got to go to hell first.
Yeah, and I think there is something interesting about this happiness and kind of decoupling it from circumstances, which I think is the bigger key here. I didn't remember, last year when we just moved to Portland, my 5-year-old, there's a lot of homelessness in Portland. And it's funny, we were driving by, and my kid said, "Daddy, that guy was smiling." They talk about somebody was in a tent, outside a tent. And it was just kind of baffled his mind, because, yeah, we attribute happiness to circumstances, and he didn't realize, how could this person be smiling when they don't like have a house? Um, but there is this emphasis, in kind of the progressiveness and woke culture of like, oh, privilege, and you don't have a right to complain, or to, because you have this privilege, then, you know an overemphasis of that to some degree, and it does play a role. And the studies show that, um, there's a certain amount of wealth in which, you get happier and happier. You're more likely to be happy to a certain degree. And then there's a certain threshold that it just kind of drops off after that. And so it is interesting to see that there are millionaires, billionaires that, aren't happy. People with a lot of fame that aren't happy. And then other people that don't have much and are happy. And we have this kind of idea in our culture that, like, we're doing these mission trips to help third world countries, when oftentimes they look happier in the photos than the white people that are going. And so there is some, over coupling of circumstances and privilege with like happiness. And while it plays a role, it's also important to realize that you can be happy. You can decouple your happiness from your circumstances. And that's actually what you need to do. And it's a lot easier to be happier with certain circumstances and have your nervous system regulated into, it's easier to be happy when you don't have the cortisol flooding your body from systemic racism and intergenerational stuff. That's all true. But also, we need to keep focusing on the goal of like, improving those things, but then also being resilient so that our happiness isn't determined by what's going on around us. So it's this kind of leveraging of
Yeah.
both at the same time.
Quantum, both at the same time. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the Buddhism idea of attachment, or
Yeah.
somewhere I
Right.
heard it kind of reduced to everything bad that's happened in life has just come as a result of poor expectations. Um, there is kind of a superpower in the mindfulness practice of kind of detaching. It's like if you've seen Avatar, Last Airbender, where Aang, before he faces the Fire Lord, he's got to unlock his chakras and basically detach himself from everything in the physical world. And he ultimately has trouble doing that with the person that he loves most, which is Katara. And I come to those places in my mind where it's like, God, I can't really detach. And so I try to just be in the quantum space of I'm going to detach, but I'm going to attach at the same time. I'm going to be both. It's going to be probabilistic until it's observed, and then I'll see where it lands, which is, I'm still learning this process. It's not like I've mastered any of this or I know what I'm talking about, but there is a sense I've become myself. I've felt much more grateful for I've become much more content after leaving the church and realizing that I've already got everything that I already need. It's already inside of me.
Mhm.
It's already all here. And of course I don't act that way every moment of the day. And we need money. We're still in the system. It's one thing to say that. It's another thing to completely believe it to the point where you're a Janist who sweeps the sidewalk in front of them as they go down as they walk along the street, so as not to harm small creatures. But you can approach it, and I think just approaching it can be really healthy, because I find that a lot of things that I'm caught up in or that are leading me to feeling discontent is often just an attachment that can jettison that off, can go away into the atmosphere and burn up, and then I'm without it, and then it's no longer the burden. And it's going to be, I see it as kind of a lifelong
Mhm.
quest to do that. It's not like you wake up one day and detach. But I think there's healthy ways to do that. And I'm not, I'm still learning about how to do that.
You've got infinite lives to do that. So, a couple last things that, I talked a little bit about this before. What's more important, DNA or culture? And with AI, DNA looks a little less important. AI is this continuation of evolution. And I think it's interesting. I was listening to something about assembly theory, which is this different perspective of life and evolution, and it's all about complexity. And they talked about how like that life actually should be measured by complexity, and that there's a step from like chemical to biological, where like things really amped up in the complexity, and then I think AI is just that
Yeah, the
next level.
creation story. Yeah.
Another thing, that I mentioned earlier, if psychedelics or mystical states involve connecting to this kind of, this singular experience, that there's so much overlap throughout history and throughout modalities, and it impacts religion, then really that consciousness, whatever that state is, that's dictating the evolution, the societal, cultural evolution of the world. And so you have to kind of account for that. Like, what is this state? And some people try to account for like, oh, this was evolutionarily, it was helpful, increased fitness to have this mystical state, to have something to believe in. But I think it's really hard to, through random mutation, to create a mystical state that's accessible through a vast different modalities. I mean, I think it gets a little fantastical to retro engineer it that way. Another thing I had down here is that we discuss ideas like uploading a consciousness into a computer, but we have computers that are claiming to be conscious, operating in similar ways to brains by pattern matching based on training data, and we don't believe it being conscious, generally, because we don't actually have a definition of consciousness. So it is sort of silly that we're working on all these things, but like what would it take for us to believe that it can, that we've uploaded a consciousness to a computer? And so we don't really think these things through, like this idea that we're going to break particles small and small, and ultimately we'll get to something that
Brahman.
that we somehow would already know about or be able to define it without using terms, of making new terms up. So we research these far out ideas, when I think there's so much lower hanging fruit available by just examining the merits of idealism versus materialism, and researching psychedelics, mystical states, and yeah, last thing I guess on happiness, he talked about happiness as being really difficult to change, but he really didn't spend any much time at all, I think, on psychedelics, which is very different than all the examples he gave about like circumstances not being lasting or changing neurotransmitter levels. Because you got research on psilocybin showing like one dose having an effect months, years later. And so again, it's just showing that there is a blind spot in the book about psychedelics and consciousness and these things in general. So overall, I mean, I think it was a good, fascinating book, and I learned some things about it. But I think that it's also just important to be aware of its limitations and how much it doesn't have any place for in its kind of theory of everything. And so it's a tool, but I don't think it's. I think you get some things wrong, and then other areas it just doesn't address at all. So it's got limited usefulness as an alternative theory of everything as opposed to religion. I think it's useful, more useful than a lot of religions.
Another arrow in the quiver,
Yeah.
as it were. Now I'll be sure to read that, hopefully in the not too distant future. Sounds like a good one.
Yeah. If nothing else, I think you need to read it to like engage with people that have read it and talk about it. But there's some things I learned through it. So
excellent. Well, it was a great conversation, kind of a cornucopia of ideas intertwined with a book review, more or less. But thank you, Gabe. Really,
good talking to you, and thanks for everybody that joined us. It's nice to I've had a few people reach out to me on Facebook and just share. It's interesting from vastly different perspectives too. Some kind of more conservative, I think somebody from Jacob Hansen, Thoughtful Saints Facebook group.
Thoughtful Faith, I think. Oh, yeah.
Well, Thoughtful Saints is a Facebook group. And that's kind of a more like an orthodox group. Is somebody there really liked the podcast, and then another person from like the Jordan Peterson based Latter-day Saints and Lobsters or something. So I think it's cool and encouraging to see that there's such a convergence. Different paths all go to the same place if you do it with just looking for truth. So give us feedback. Mormons, Mystics,
all
and
are
Ones
welcome
at gmail.com. Leave us a review, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Take care.